Welcome to the Sons of Thunder. My name is Joel Sedecase, the older, wiser, much more fashionable, much more, shall we say, Jordan Peterson-esque of the brothers, in that I am a deep thinker. I am
Yeah.
in that
I don't apostate and
well, more like a Christian version of Jordan Peterson.
yeah, that's
very,
great.
very orthodox. Hey, could you hear that music, by the way, that was playing?
I couldn't, and I don't think I'll hear anything after this conversation because you're screaming so loud.
Well, I've got these headphones in and I can't hear myself. So in order to hear myself, I've got to yell. It's okay though. It's fine. I'll accept it.
Yeah.
So who are you?
I'm Parker Sedecase, and I'm the one telling my brother it's not a good look to be hyping oneself up because he loves that expression.
Oh, that's not a good look. That's not a good look. One time I had an atheist tell me, I don't want you to be inconsistent, Joel. It's not a good look.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, what is that?
Is that a standard? That triggered you worse than any of his arguments ever could.
Well, he didn't have any arguments. That was his argument. Yeah. It's not a good look.
Well, it worked.
How did that work? It didn't work.
We're still talking about it here.
That wasn't his goal. His goal was to get me to agree with his atheism.
Yeah.
Epic fail.
Well, dude, I'm stoked to talk about this one today. This whole chapter is jam-packed.
How you liking your lockdown, man? Before we get into it, how's lockdown?
We were pretty nervous first because Julie's my wife is immunocompromised.
I know.
So we're pretty nervous about it, but we don't care anymore. I think she's fine. We're all fine. Kind of just ready to get back to it. You know, I was studying for finals and everything, so it was.
You were going to be quarantined anyway.
Business as usual.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good. It's all about you.
Yeah, I'm doing well. That's all that really matters.
How did the semester wrap up for you, man?
Good. I just got one of my papers back and got some really good notes on it.
Oh, that's good. What paper was that? The perspective on perspectivalism?
No. It was for Netland. It was the epistemological spiral is what I call it.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so it's transcendental arguments in favor of Christian theocentric realism from the possibility of inference to the best explanation.
Okay, so just as a little background for people who are not as familiar with the Sons of Thunder and kind of like, who are these people? Just a quick introduction. Parker, who are you? What do you do? Because I think we're going to get some new listeners on this one. So like, why are you writing papers?
Yeah. So I'm a grad student at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And this semester was a fun one because I got to TA for the undergrad. So I got to teach a little bit in philosophy. I was also taking a philosophy course and logic in the undergrad, taking some master's courses, and then also taking one PhD course. So I got to experience the full range of Trinity.
That's awesome. And you've also been doing some teaching at another school as well, right? You've been working with some undergrad students.
That's at right? the school. Oh, yeah. So in the undergrad here, I helped teach a philosophy course.
Oh, I thought you were doing that. Oh, no. You know what I was thinking of? You went over to Northwestern and you were working with a professor over there, correct?
No, but we teach our students stuff.
You were working with some other professor outside of Trinity, though.
PhD student. There's a lot. Yeah, I got a lot going on. It's awesome.
That's the problem, man. You start collecting mentors the way you do, and you lose track of them.
That's right.
Oh, I forgot about that guy. Yeah, I learned a lot.
Yeah. Now they all know that I don't keep track of them very well.
Well, they're not going to watch this.
So I wrote a paper for my religious epistemology class.
Meaning what? Knowledge, religious epistemology. I took that class with Netland, by the way. Yeah. I think I might have had Yandel actually for it. May he rest in peace. But okay, so you're talking about knowledge from a religious perspective. Is that the gist?
Yeah, it was super good. So I made a series of arguments in favor of the Christian worldview from the possibility of inference to the best explanation, which is we infer to best explanations all the time.
Yeah.
So we use it in science. We use it in religious debates. We use it in my opening paragraph. I said that most importantly, we use it to find out who ate the last piece of pizza, deep dish pizza in the fridge.
Yeah.
Right. And so we infer that an alien could have taken it, but that's not really the best explanation.
Not really plausible.
It's probably my wife when I went to bed.
Yeah. Did that happen? Is that a real true story?
No, it's not. That would have been me eating her food.
I was going to say
she's a saint.
Probably the other way around. So today we're talking about rule number 2 in this book. If you can see that there, The 12 Rules for Life by Jordan B. Peterson. And last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, we talked about rule number 1. Let's just go ahead and get into it, man. And I've titled this video, What Every Christian Needs to Know About Jordan Peterson on Human Nature. Because I think, feel free to disagree, but I think at the heart of his second rule is the question of what does it mean to be man? What does it mean to be human? And would you agree with that?
You know, he goes into a lot of good stuff, but I'm not sure there is a central theme in this one. He does talk about that.
You don't think so?
He goes all over the place. You think he's going to start talking about creation care and, you know, humans caring for animals, and he takes a different turn. And I would say it has to do with the nature of self-consciousness and sin. So yeah, maybe if that's, yeah. Are you hearing the?
I'm hearing a beepy beepy.
Yeah,
that's on you. I don't know what that is.
My thing is low. So I'm going to switch headphones.
Okay. So while you're doing that, I want to throw a Bible verse out there, and that is Romans 2:7. And the reason I want to throw this out at the beginning, because this is where I want to circle back around to at the end. This is one of my all-time favorite verses in Scripture. It's Romans chapter 2, verse 7. This is part of an epistle or a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the Roman church. And actually, to really understand it, you've got to go back to verse 6. But here's what it says. God will repay each one according to his deeds. And here's verse 7. To those who by patience in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. And dude, that verse resonates with me so much after reading this chapter, and I want to explain why that is. But first, let's get into it. So,
hey, is this? Are you hearing me well?
Yeah, you sound fine.
I don't know if this is picking up or not.
That's not picking up. It's still coming through your good microphone, so it's all good.
Awesome.
Yeah. So rule 1 was stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule 2 is treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And you were saying there's no central theme in this, but what's the main argument that Peterson's making here?
Well, dude, this is really interesting because he begins with this crazy statistic about drugs, about pills, you know, your prescribed medicine. He says, let me just read it. He says, imagine that 100 people are prescribed a drug. Consider what happens next. 1/3 of them won't fill the prescription. Half of the remaining 67 will fill it, but won't take the medication correctly. They'll miss doses. They'll quit taking it entirely. They might not even take it at all. So it's crazy. So what he's talking about is self-care. He's saying that we don't take care of ourselves very well, and then that is setting up his whole thesis of chapter 2, that you should treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And so he moves on right from there to animals, where he talks about, you know, take your dog to the vet, and you have a better shot if you take the dog to the vet in the first place. Then you obviously care about your dog, and you're going to follow up better with his medication or her medication than you would even for yourself. And so that's what he's taught. That impetus, that inclination, is what he's using to say, hey, just treat yourself like that, like you treat your dog or someone that you're responsible for caring for. Think of yourself that way. And since this is a self-help book, he's helping you reorient yourself towards yourself in order to have a better life.
Yeah, it's really interesting because basically what he says is, you know, people don't take their pills. He unfolds this whole narrative. He introduces this mythological understanding. Really, it's a theological understanding of humanity. And then he says, in light of what it means to be man, no wonder you don't take your pills, because who would ever want to take care of a depraved wretch like yourself? But then at the end, he sort of tries to bandage the wound that he's just inflicted on you, or maybe the wound that he's pointed out that you have in your psyche or in your self-understanding. And he tries to offer you some salve and to say, well, here's why you should take care of yourself. And I got to be honest, man, as much as I enjoyed this chapter and there were things that resonated with me, his conclusion, I mean, this is an argument that is drawing heavily on the biblical worldview, and he does not, I don't think he closes the loop.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. So he brings us right to Genesis, and actually, when he's talking about the animals, for me that strikes a chord. I love animals. I love dogs. I love turtles. I love everything. Um, and so he brings it to Genesis, but on page 33 he says, in concluding that we take care of our dogs and we don't take care of ourselves very well, he says it is difficult to conclude anything from this set of facts except that people appear to love their dogs, cats, ferrets, and birds, maybe even their lizards, more than themselves. How horrible is that? How much shame must exist for something like that to be true? What could it be about people that makes them prefer their pets to themselves? And then he goes, it was an ancient story in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Old Testament, that helped me find an answer to that perplexing question. And I thought this is interesting because I think immediately of Proverbs 12:10, where it talks about a righteous man considers the life of his animals. And there is something to that, where maybe it's not so much self-hatred, but there is this burden that we feel towards God's creation. It's originally part of our design to care for creation, to steward well, to exercise dominion and authority over the animals and over. I thought that's actually that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, it is a good thing, and yet our relationship with the animal world, is the animal kingdom, is there's a weird tension there though too, isn't there?
There is dog moms, right?
Yeah, right. I saw someone had a magnet on the back of their car that said like my grandchildren are puppies or something like that. Or,
something crazy.
It's like, oh, lady, that's really sad. I'm assuming it's a lady. It could have been a man, but geez, lady, that's pretty. You should really tell your. You should take that magnet off and tell your kids to have real kids, because you're going to be real disappointed in about 11 years. Your grandbabies are going to be put down, lady.
Yeah. So there definitely is that like disordered ordering, right?
Right. Yeah,
and we're showing that that is part of who we are, but we've warped it and we've twisted it.
You want to know something really, really fascinating? So there's this documentary out called this is getting at the relationship between man and animal and the Bible, and we need to talk about Peterson's interpretation of Genesis. But there's this new documentary called The Riot and the Dance, Water. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I've just seen clips of it. It looks awesome.
Oh, dude. I started watching it last night with Elisa. So stinking good. And there's one scene, man, you want to freak your wife out? I'm watching this and I'm loving it. But Elisa, this is a woman who wants to go skydiving, by the way. Totally fine with the idea of skydiving, which I'm like, not a chance. No way. But she's watching this this one segment where the documentarian is getting down into the water. This is shark infested water. And now these, I forget the species of shark. It was not a great white, but it was like a Galapagos shark, which are not as ferocious as great whites, but they will attack a man.
Yeah.
Okay. But he goes down into the water. And as you see him go down, he's narrating, and he says, here are the rules about getting into the water with infested with sharks. Number one, make aggressive eye contact. And he goes on to this little theological narration, this little exposition, and he says the reason why this works from a biblical perspective. Well, he says we don't know exactly why it works, but there's something in this that after the flood, God told Noah that the fear of man was going to be upon all the animals, including the fish of the sea. And so what the documentarian is saying is he's implying that when you look a shark dead in the eyes, there is something being communicated there. It's not that the shark thinks you're a bigger, nastier shark. That's what his scuba instructors told him. Instead, it's you're asserting your manhood, your humanness over the shark, and there's something intrinsic in the shark that wants to back off from that. The shark knows that you've been given dominion over it. And
I don't know, man.
Listen, this is what he says. Oh, you don't agree?
I don't think it's personalizing the shark too much.
It's not, but it's no more personalizing than it is to say that a salmon knows how to swim upstream back to the land of its spawning, or a spider knows how to
because that's another personification. It doesn't know. It just
it knows in a
reacts,
different
right?
way. Well,
Sure.
yeah, but it knows in the way that a spider knows how to, that a goose knows how to fly south for the winter, and may they all do so and stop hanging around Illinois.
Yeah. No, I feel that, dude. There's something weird. It's like a weird. I'm uncomfortable to talk about it because it's kind of woo-woo, kind of weird stuff. But like,
Yeah.
I love catching turtles, right? Turtles and frogs.
Yeah, we know this.
When they see me and they know that I've seen them, even if they're across the pond, they jump in. And it's like this weird thing where I'm like, how did you know that I was conscious of you?
Yeah.
You know, and
then I'm coming for you.
It could be that I'm just spending way too much time, tracking down turtles, and I'm saying,
yeah, they're beginning to talk back.
Yeah. That's when I know it's time to go home.
Yeah. Well,
so
let's talk about Genesis.
Yeah, man. So this is where Peterson introduces his whole chaos and order schema, right? And he talks about so in a sense, you said that he is borrowing from the Christian worldview. He's using this framework. He is and he isn't, because he's imposing his own, right? He's imposing this order, chaos, dualistic view of the world onto the Genesis motif, or onto motifs in Genesis as well. And so he talks about order and chaos. And the book is actually, it's 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. And he's been taken not to task, but that's been brought up to him before, where he talks about order being masculine and chaos being feminine. And so this one feminist journalist said, antidote. How come it's not an antidote to order as well? It seems like are you being anti-feminine here?
Well, because he associates chaos with matter, which he says, matter is derived from the Greek word mater, which means mother. Yeah, chaos is the mother. Order is God the Father. I mean, that's getting
it's pretty crazy. Yeah. So he talks about the schema where and order isn't just good on its own, because he talks about order being authoritarian and
tyrannical.
Right. Yeah. Tyrannical. Totally. The tyrannical father that eats his son. There's also a tyrannical mother, but so he's talking about these two, not as if order is the key and chaos is inherently bad, but he talks about this razor's edge between the two, the line between the yin and the yang, and that's the sweet spot where you're turning chaos into order.
He says that, but then the whole chapter presents chaos in a way that is actually associated not only with the feminine, but with evil, actually. Like his examples of order, after he gets past the fact where he's the point where he makes the comparison of too much order can be tyrannical. The rest of the comparisons are all about how chaos is manifested in fearful circumstances and actual malevolence and evil. And he does it in a way, man, where it's not just like a corrective. You might say, well, our society is more chaotic, so he's got to emphasize the negative elements of chaos so that he can provide the antidote and sort of get us back balanced. But I don't think so, because
it does seem like he's tipped one direction, right, towards order a little bit more.
Yeah, so I could understand that feminists.
I thought that was an interesting
critique
point
there.
Yeah. And maybe that's just him not being careful, not thinking through or being careful with his words. But
or maybe he's borrowing more from, maybe he wants to talk more about good and evil, but because he's not a Christian, he can't. So he says chaos and order, but then he really starts talking about good and evil. And it's like, dude, you can't, those are two separate things there. And you're slipping, you're not able to coherently talk about these things anymore.
Yeah. So when he goes in on, he's got a lot of dualisms going on. Wow. He's got a lot of dualisms going on. He's talking about order, chaos, right? Then he talks about, and in this order, chaos, this is something that's unique to Peterson, that he takes the ball further than Jung did. And so he's wanting to develop that and ultimately ground the order chaos scheme in the two halves or hemispheres of your brain. So right brain, left brain kind of stuff. And so he's talking about chaos is the domain of ignorance. It's the unexplored territory. And then order is explored territory. And so that's your mind's way of interacting in the world. And so, chaos is the nighttime. It's the snake. It's the unexplored things that you don't know, you're not aware of yet.
It's also the womb. It's also potentiality. I mean, his dualisms definitely interact there. There's the male-female dualism, and then there's the order chaos, and then there's this latent good evil. and he wants them all to be the same. But
well, and so he's got the world of experience, and then he's got the world of science, right?
Right, the world of action and the world of things.
Yeah, and he says that, and this is something that's interesting too, because this is a lot of Christians talk about this, right? Like Calvin, we live in the theater of God, right? And we're called to act. Van Hooser picks this up. A lot of people pick up this idea of this drama of lived experience. And so Peterson says within the realm of the world of experience, that's where the two fundamental elements are order and chaos. Because you don't see order and chaos in science. That's something that we have to impose on and view. And that's really interesting. That's what Husserl talked about, the Lebenswelt, like the life world. That's phenomenology, right? He's saying that is for us the basic thing, and he roots that in Darwinistic evolution as well.
Peterson does, or are you saying Husserl?
Peterson does, but he's talking about what Husserl is talking about in his phenomenology, the Lebenswelt.
So this is where it gets a little sticky, okay? Because and I owe this next insight to one of the authors, Esther O'Reilly, in this book, Myth and Meaning, in Jordan Peterson.
I didn't know she had a contribution in there.
Oh, yeah, dude. She's what?
She's super interesting.
Oh, really good. And you know what she does is she brings in this really, so you know Francis Schaeffer, obviously.
Know him personally, yeah.
Yeah, and for those listening, Francis Schaeffer is deceased. But I know you disagree with some of Schaeffer's methodology.
Yeah.
But
his history too is
his what?
His whole historical framework is
fine,
okay.
Sure, that's fine.
Better than I.
Yeah. By the way, did you get a haircut?
I did. One of my friends did it.
What?
Yeah. Boom.
It looks good, dude.
Thanks, man.
I'm the only guy who hasn't. Look at this mop I got going on here, man. Yeah. I'm the only one who hasn't gotten a haircut. I'm bringing back the Pops look from the 70s.
Is that? Yeah.
He had a true fro.
Yeah.
I'm like,
all right. So back to Esther here.
So here's the thing. So Esther O'Reilly, what she says is, she goes, when Peterson talks about the world as a like a theater for action, or as an arena for action, versus a world of things, what Peterson is doing is he's talking about it's Schaeffer's two stories. I don't know if Peterson knows that. I mean, I don't know if Peterson's ever read Francis Schaeffer. I haven't seen any.
Yes.
No, but it's this idea that the world is divided into the concrete and objective story below, which is accessible to science, and the upper story, the top floor, which is more the subjective world of archetypes and ideas. And the interesting thing is, Peterson says that the upper story, he doesn't call it the upper story. Again, I'm mixing my two thinkers here. Okay.
Sure.
But he says that that's more fundamental.
Yeah, exactly. That's the Lebenswelt.
Yes.
And it actually goes back further than it goes back further. I mean, to Husserl, it goes back even further. But
Immanuel Kant. I mean,
Plato, right? The forms. And,
sure.
Right,
yeah.
But C.S. Lewis actually does a really, really good job of this. I used it in one of my papers in what he talks about meditation in a tool shed. Have I talked to you about this before? You can look at, you see a beam coming down through the corner. It's all
so you're in a tool shed. It's totally dark.
Yeah, you got a hole in the corner. You got a light beam coming down. You can see dust. You can look at that scientifically, and you can look at the photons and all that kind of stuff. You can analyze it, right? And you can say this is a beam, or you can turn your head and look along it. And outside, you can see through it, right? And you can see the trees outside. You get all this stuff. So Lewis is talking about these two different perspectives, the subjective perspective and the objective first person, third person perspectives. And he's saying that for so long, and this is so funny because he wrote it in 1945, maybe. And he said for so long, the third person perspective has been beating up on the first person, but not even realizing that they are presupposing the first person in order to do so. Right. So
flesh that out, man. Flesh that out.
So check this out. So a neuroscientist looks at the gray matter in your head and says, "This is it. That's what it is." You think you're having thoughts. You look at this mathematician, and he thinks he's contemplating eternal truths when he's looking at math, but really it's just the gray matter in his head. And Lewis says you can only do that because you have this first person perspective from which you're talking about. What if another? He calls him neurophysiologist or something, whatever the terminology was. Another guy comes and looks at yours, he can say the exact same thing about you.
You think you're talking about this mathematician, but really it's just the gray matter in your brain.
Exactly. And you can do that ad nauseum. And so he's saying, or ad infinitum. And Lewis goes on to use his famous, he loves saying this at the end of his argument. He'll say, well, you can't have a proof that there's no proofs. This would be a proof that there's no proofs, right? Yeah. And it's just so great. Yeah. But yeah, Lewis talks about these two different realms, these two different worlds they're both necessary, but insofar as we are all persons with a first person perspective, yeah, that the fundamental one is that the Lebenswelt.
So Peterson, let's talk about his interaction with Genesis. So first of all, he's presupposing the documentary hypothesis, which says that Genesis was the creation accounts of Genesis. If you open up your Bible, you've got what appears to be two different creation stories. You've got chapter 1, and then you've got chapter 2 through 11. And what Peterson says is 2 through 11 is an older story, and chapter 1 is a newer story that was added to it. And what he says, again, this idea that Genesis was written by multiple authors, it's not actually true.
We talked about this last time. It's the JEDP model.
Right.
The Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and Priestly.
Right. So he says you've got the Yahwist and the Priestly stories sort of juxtaposed, kind of fused together here. But one of the things that I like about how Peterson enters into this story of Genesis is he says, prior to modern science, the world was seen as a place of action, not as a place of things. And this is kind of what we're talking about. What he says is the great thinkers, all the way down to the average individual, the unschooled, guy just trying to plow the field and go about his life, understood the world in a non-scientific way. There was more of a storied understanding, more of a mythological understanding. So Peterson has no problem taking Genesis seriously, even if he doesn't think it's literally true. And and
he thinks it's more important than literal truth. He thinks it's mythological truth, which for him is deeper. It tells us more about who we are and our story. So mythological truth for him, it's not like an add-on that's okay, it's safe in here. He thinks that's more important.
Right, that's right. And this gets
people who have to act, right? And he's a pragmatist, so of course that makes sense.
Yeah, and he calls this the domain not of matter, but of what matters.
Yeah,
and this
is pretty good wordplay too he had going on there.
Yeah, very good. And it's interesting. What do you think about his comparison of order and chaos? He says order and chaos are to drama as molecules and quarks basically are to matter. These are the fundamental elements that make up the world of our experience, this drama we find ourselves in. Do you like that?
I like that, as long as there's not like a necessity claim there, because
what do you mean by what's a necessity claim?
So that's something he totally does get wrong about the Genesis account. It's not so he talks about God makes the world, and it's void and empty, right? And it's the world of chaos, and then God has to walk that line between the yin and the yang, and he creates order of chaos. It wasn't like, it's not the chaos that he's talking about. God didn't have to do anything like that. So it's not an internal struggle like Augustine, who are those folks that the Manichaeans, right? It's not like this ultimate dualism where there's two gods and there's, right? For us though, in the world we live in, yeah, dude, that's totally what makes a good story. Pops talks about this all the time, right? Dad actually read a bunch of Joseph Campbell back in the day and talked about the hero with 1,000 or 10,000 faces.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Every good story has life, death, and resurrection. And dude, that's right. If you see a good movie on TV or in the theaters, whatever, Jackie Chan has to get beat up first. Right. And that's why Superman has to have kryptonite. Otherwise it's boring. He's just too
good romance, they have to have a breakup or be on the verge of divorce or something like that, or bankruptcy. Yeah. And then, they've
order and chaos. Yeah. And so we would say that represents, that story is so good because it represents God's story. And Peterson would say the Bible is such a good story because it represents this eternal order chaos dialectic. Right. So you see how we're flipping the two?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And again, when he talks about order and chaos, sometimes I you can just tell he wants to talk about good and evil. He'll say evil. He'll use evil as if it has meaning, but he will not accept the objective standard that we would say is necessary for talking about evil.
Well, he would go pretty close. He would say stuff that sounds to us like, "Oh yeah, man, we could totally get down with you." But when you look at maps of meaning, he grounds it in evolutionary history, and he even sounds like he says he's regretting that he has to say this, but it's on this shifting sands of even within archetypes, right? It's been progressively, it's through dialectic, we've come to view our morals the way we do.
So this is one of the things. So if we're trying to provide, tools, and I might put something in the show notes about how, we really start talking about, Peterson's arguments at like the 30-minute mark. So if you're just joining us right now, we've been sort of doing an introduction to the second rule of Jordan Peterson, which is treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. And we've been given an introduction to his thought. And what we've talked about is how he views the book of Genesis in the Bible and some of his fundamental presuppositions. Like he doesn't necessarily think it's literally true. He thinks it's more mythologically true. Whereas Parker and I, as Christians, we're going to say not only is it mythologically true, not only is it important, but it is also literally true. Yeah. So there's already a that's difference in our starting points.
Talking about Schaeffer, that's something that Schaeffer talks about a lot, that God tells stories in space and time.
That's right.
God, of course it's a story. Yeah, absolutely. But God paints with reality like we paint with colors.
I love that. So now we're talking about how Peterson views the world that is the world of our experience, which Peterson says is actually more important than scientific truth. He calls it the domain not of matter, but of what matters. And he really gets into this dichotomy between order and chaos. So if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, which I posted something earlier today about what is the best movie soundtrack of all time and why is it Fellowship of the Ring? And then I posted a GIF of Gandalf from Return of the King, like an idiot. Instead of
that's awesome.
Instead of posting one from the Fellowship of the Ring. But somebody, Dan Goulson, pointed that out, my buddy Dan Goulson. But Peterson says order is the Shire. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, which Park, I know you are, obviously.
Yeah.
Chaos is Smaug, or you might say Smaug the dragon. Okay, in those stories, or you might say, order is Geppetto's woodmaking shop. Okay, chaos is the belly of Monstro the whale in the story of Pinocchio. All right, order is a stable marriage. Chaos is finding out your spouse has been committing infidelity.
Which,
adultery.
dude, that is really actually super profound. Where Peterson talks about this in a lot of his lectures online. He talks about how it enters you into a different world.
Yeah,
everything you thought was a lie.
Yeah,
you're in this world. You think you're in this happy relationship. You come home and find your spouse cheating on you or something, and you drop into a different world.
Yeah,
and it's just like, and that's what he talks about a lot with self-consciousness, and he talks about that a lot, actually. Consciousness and self-consciousness. We should get into that a little bit too.
Yeah, definitely. And again, what Christians need to understand is that when Peterson is talking about order and chaos, he says that I almost said the well-ordered life, but really the life that has meaning is the life that's sort of on the razor's edge between order and chaos. And yet, when you actually read this book, when you actually read 12 Rules for Life, what you find is the way he presents order does seem to be better than chaos. Order does seem to be more in line with the good. So
I think he was, he had some problems with anti-anxiety pills, I think, and stuff like that.
He did
in rehab, and
personally.
So he was supposed to be coming out with a book, I think, in 2020, which might have been a response to order. I think that was how it was slated. So
is that right?
So it could be that we're totally. It would make sense with his diagram or his dialogical method here, but so I wanted to put that out there just in case, like he's.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. That's good. So okay. So he talks about order and chaos. He says the potential for chaos is real and it matters. He says this is actually a quote. He says, even the oldest and most familiar places retain an ineradicable capacity to surprise you. Man, isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
You know, like I still remember, you know, the house we grew up in on Charlotte Street in Lombard. You go to that street today. In fact, I went back there, you know, probably a couple of years ago. I drove past, but even like I've looked it up on Google Maps since then. The whole block, the whole street, it's the same place, man, but it looks completely different.
Yeah.
Like our house, our old house burned down, as you know.
Yeah.
There's a new house there, totally different. The house across the street is different. It's just a completely different place. It's a well-ordered place. I'm not saying it's not, but it's the change from what we grew up with to what it's like now.
Yeah. Well,
I feel the chaos there.
Well, dude, and he talks about this walled garden. So he's talking about Genesis, right? And he's talking about the snake, the serpent in the garden. And what he's talking about with that is that you can clean up your whole house, you can plug all the holes and stuff, and a mouse can still get in, or you'll still find a spider.
Yeah.
Right. You can never actually plug up every hole and keep chaos out. So right. Even in the garden, you see the snake, and he goes on to say that something along the lines of like maybe God thought his creation would be able to handle the serpent and considered its presence the lesser of two evils, because even God couldn't keep the snake out of the garden.
Yeah, I'm gonna cringe at that one.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty cringeworthy.
Once you start saying even God couldn't.
Right.
And you know, Park, you and I, this would be a good time to mention. Parker and I have done a video before on an episode of the Sons of Thunder where we talk about why God's limits make him greater, and we talk about how God is
He's
not
limited by his perfection, right? Yeah.
That's right. He's limited by his perfection. And reading, in other words, God can't do something that's immoral. God can't do something that's illogical. And there's no problem saying God's limited by that. But yeah. I don't quite know that Peterson is, you know, he views God more as a mental concept anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't know that
he's tricky on that. We've talked about that too.
Yeah.
But so he talks about, when he talks about the serpent, he says he considers the serpent story like a just so story.
Right.
A just so story is like a primitive mythological story of, you know, how the serpent lost his legs, kids.
Yeah.
You know, and so the serpent had legs. And, you know, I always was kind of curious about that until I took Dr. Carson's class. And he says it's not a just so story, but it's a reinterpretation of the serpent, where even if he slithered on his belly before, it could have been seen as this really ingenuitive way to travel. That's really interesting. Look at that thing winding around. And then with the new interpretation, it's you're crawling on your belly in the dirt, and this is a bad thing. So after the fall, it's reinterpretation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this just so story. We always assume that it had legs, because God, when he punishes them, he says, now you'll crawl on. And so Carson's saying it's probably more of just a reinterpretation.
Well, also just think of, you know, the narrative here. You want to talk about meaning. Think about where you first you first see the snake sort of associated with the tree. And I don't know that it explicitly says he's in the tree, but he's there.
Yeah.
You know, and he's sort of talking with Eve as a almost as an equal. So there's definitely some tipping of the scales here in terms of who's more important, who's supposed to have dominion over the other. But you can almost imagine the serpent coming down the tree and speaking to Eve, and then God says, "Well, now you're going to be in the dust. You know, now you're going to, you know." So there's this physical displacement or replacement of the serpent, which is almost, you know, which is analogous to when Jesus says in the New Testament, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." You know, Satan, this eternal serpent, is falling from this exalted position. Yeah. Which again, that doesn't mean that the Genesis story is false from a scientific perspective or historical perspective.
Yeah. Well, so Peterson, here's where Peterson gets into his self-conscious versus consciousness distinction. And he says, you know, before Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they were conscious people. They lived in this walled garden. Now the snake enters, and he talks about the snake. You know, even God can't keep the chaos out of the order. Just like we see in the yin and the yang, we see the black dot inside the white, and the white dot inside. He uses that a lot. And so Adam and Eve, they fall, and in falling, they become self-conscious, and they become And really, he's using it not in the philosophical sense, but in the psychological sense, which makes sense for him, right? But
Yeah.
it's this vulnerability. Now you're self-aware and you see that, oh, you're a squishy human, right? You're like this human evolved ape and you don't have all the protective covering that you used to have. And so that's what he means by self-consciousness, that it's actually like you're self-conscious in the way that you're going to a party and you're self-conscious, right?
Yeah, it's like that recurring dream that everybody has about being on stage in their underwear.
Totally.
Or I used to always have this dream that I was being called back to my high school and I had to I can remember this really vividly, man. I would get called back to my high school because I used to do theater in high school.
Yeah.
And they needed someone to play the lead role in this play, and the play was starting, and I had to jump on stage, but I didn't know any of my lines. And at one point, I was handed, this is bizarre, but it was a dream, a cracker, and on this cracker this was the only script that I received, and it was like this little word that was stamped on a cracker. And here you go. Now get out there and say your lines. In other words, I was like completely unprepared, completely ill-equipped to get out there. But it's this feeling of vulnerability, this feeling of totally not being prepared. And this is like this common meme that shows up in human experience, these dreams that we have, this feeling of being ashamed, of being unprepared, of falling short. And Peterson says this is what's reflected in the Genesis narrative. And he roots it in our evolutionary past, whereas we would say, well, no, it's actually rooted in an actual moral fall that took place in our history.
And actually, I would distinguish, I think, so when we talk about consciousness, I've been studying that a lot this semester for my philosophy of mind reading course. Consciousness, squirrels are conscious. Right, bats are conscious. Thomas Nagel has this famous paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" Where he talks about this the irreducibility of the first-person perspective. And first-person perspective, right? Squirrels aren't persons in the sense that we attribute moral personhood to them, but because they're not self-conscious. But if there's something that it's like to be that, then it's conscious. There's nothing that it's like to be a tree. It has no perspective, right? It's not conscious. But so in philosophy of mind, make this distinction. There are conscious things if it's something that it's like to be that. And then I would root the self-consciousness in the fact that we are made in God's image. Right there in Genesis 1, we are made self-conscious like God is self-conscious. Self-conscious meaning that we can reflect on things, we can study mathematics, we can observe ourselves in a mirror. We can actually fashion mirrors in order to look at ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. So there is the aspect of the psychological self-consciousness where you can be self-aware and stuff. Mm-hmm. But that didn't come with the fall for us. That came with being imago Dei, being in the image of God. What came from the fall is the understanding of evil, right? Like we had an understanding of good. Everything was good. God knew good and evil, but we didn't know evil. And now we have this first-person awareness of evil. And so even the serpent's lie was like a half-truth, right? Like he's like, you'll know good and evil just like God. Well, God doesn't know evil experientially.
Yeah.
We do. We learned it. We have this, it is a trick.
And here's the really interesting thing too. And it seems like it's becoming a rule now that I have to mention something from Doug Wilson every episode, but he talks about how actually the discernment between good and evil is not itself a bad thing. As a matter of fact, in Hebrews, we are supposed to, the author of Hebrews calls out his audience and tells them that solid food, which spiritually speaking is like the meaty truths of Christianity, of life. Mm-hmm. Solid food is for the mature who have had their senses honed by experience in order to discern, who have had their discernment honed by experience so that they can discern between good and evil. So what Adam and Eve got when they ate the fruit was they got kicked up into this level of discernment that they were not prepared for. They experienced evil, as you said, experientially.
Yeah.
Because they themselves had become evil. What God desires for us is not that kind of knowledge of good and evil. It's actually, he wants us to know the difference between good and evil because we become so good and so holy and so sanctified that we recognize evil instantly.
Yeah.
Like we should know the truth so well that we can be like Jesus when Jesus was in the desert, and Satan came to Jesus and tempted him. Satan quoted scripture, but Jesus knew scripture so well that he could instantly recognize when scripture was being used for evil versus when it was being used for good.
And he doesn't entrust himself to any man because he knows what's in man's heart. So
That's
Jesus
right.
knows good and evil without knowing it experientially.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And even as a man, he understands it, right? As
That's
the true good man.
Yeah.
So
we should talk about good and evil.
Yeah.
And that section where he says, where he talks about, oh dude, one thing though. I don't want to get off on another rabbit trail. But did you catch in the chapter where Peterson said he talks about the way of life that is proper, where you're walking that thin line between order and chaos. Yeah. And he says this is what Jesus was talking about.
Yeah, he talks about that a ton in Maps of Meaning, where Jesus is the archetypal hero, because the archetypal hero rides that razor's edge of creating order out of chaos. And so it's not a fear in it's not a totalitarian state like North Korea where you're trying to keep out all serpents and you're actually becoming a serpent yourself, right?
Yeah.
And it's not this just rabid chaos in the jungle where there are no laws, but it's really an ordered chaos where you're creating order out of chaos. You're continually on the razor's edge. And he talks about that with gymnastics. When you see someone who just got like a really high score, the next person up knows they have to go nuts. And they almost have to go, they're on the verge of chaos and they're flipping through the air, and one wrong thing and they break their neck. But that's when it draws out the best in you.
Right.
That's what he's talking about. The archetypal hero. That's the Redeemer. That's Christ.
But where it gets troublesome for me is when he literally brings in John 14:6, where Jesus makes the statement, "I am the way and the truth and the life." And Peterson goes, "See, this way of navigating between order and chaos, the masculine and the feminine, as Peterson puts it. This is the way that Christ was talking about." And it's like, man, you could not have a bigger blind spot right now, because Jesus, the statement begins with, "I am the way." Yeah. And so what Peterson wants to do is he wants to make it this abstract way of living. And Jesus says, no, the way is solid. The way is personified to the extent that it's me. Yeah. It's I am the way. So and that's like that is the exclusive claim of Christianity, that it's not just this abstract way. There's not this set of principles. It's a person that you follow. Right. And yes, there's principles in following him. Yes. But it's him. It's a guy. It's the God man. And Peterson wants to. I think he's okay with making it about imitating Christ. But again, that's still an abstraction, because this is where I wish Peterson would read a little more C.S. Lewis, especially you think about The Great Divorce, where the people who, if you've never read The Great Divorce, excellent book. Park, I know you have. I'm saying this for our listeners, but in that book, the spirits who are in hell make a trip up to heaven, and what they discover is that themselves, they being the spirits in hell, are ethereal and ghostly, but the solid spirits in heaven are much more real than anything they've ever experienced. And this, what C.S. Lewis is communicating here, is that the godly way, the way of righteousness, the way of truth is solid. It's not even reified in the sense of being like described as real, but it actually is real. And Christ is God, the immaterial person of God, the immaterial divine creator, who is more real than we are, entering our world and showing us something more real than our experience could ever have even led us to believe exists. And so if you want to know what's really real, if you want to know the way, you have to know Christ. He himself is the way personified. I think Christians need to understand that when Peterson talks about Jesus, he's dealing with abstractions, but we actually have access to something that is better and more real than even what Jordan Peterson describes.
Yeah, man, that's good. So talking about That brings up a good point, because we've been talking a lot about Peterson's view of Genesis, but this whole thing is a just so story in Peterson's mind, right? There is no historical Adam and Eve.
Right.
It's our account of what happened in our evolutionary history when our minds got big enough, when our brains got big enough to allow for this emergent mind to come forth and be able to be self-reflexive, right? So now we can reflect on ourselves, and we're boom into self-consciousness, and we're now all of a sudden we're at a higher level than the rest of the animals who are still in this process. Whether they ever reach self-consciousness or not is a different thing to note. But we are at this level now where we're able to talk and think. And so before we were able to talk about that scientifically, we used mythology. Just it erupted out of our collective our collective unconscious, and so we made this just so story of Adam and Eve eating this fruit to help understand how our brains develop the capacity for self-consciousness. And then he talks about good and evil with pain, right? So evil is pain, and goodness is this mythological dialectic of millions of years of humans interacting with each other, right? And it's like it's the abstraction or the boiling down of all those different ways that we interact with each other into a moral code.
Yeah. So when Peterson describes humanity, man and woman, as the naked ape, that's not a pejorative term. It's saying we are apes that are aware that we're naked and vulnerable.
Right.
And so now it's in this section, the naked ape, that I see I think he gets very, very close to a biblical understanding of humanity. And yet his soteriology, his doctrine of what it means for man to be saved out of his plight is, man, it's so sub-Christian. Here's why I say this. So he describes Adam and Eve hiding from God. And he says that, God is a difficult to please father. So Adam hides from him because Adam realizes he's this naked ape and he's ashamed. And this is what I think Christians need to see here. So Peterson, because he won't go all the way and say that God actually exists, and we actually are, we ought to be ashamed before God because of this moral category of sin that we've fallen into. What Peterson says is he sort of kind of shrugs his shoulders about why we have to hide before God and why God treats us the way he does. He says, why not just make the poor humans immortal right away, particularly if that is your plan for the ultimate future anyway, as the story goes. But who would dare to question God? In other words, well, man realizes that he's sinful and ashamed, and you would think God would solve the problem right then and there, but he doesn't. And who knows? Who's to say? This is all just a myth anyway, and who knows why God doesn't do that? But then he makes this statement, dude, and here's where I want to go with this. He says, quote, "Perhaps heaven is something you must build, and immortality something you must earn," end quote. Now, this I think is so it's so close, because I mentioned earlier Romans 2:7 says that to those who by patience or perseverance in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, God will grant eternal life.
Yeah.
What Peterson says is, look, maybe immortality and meaning with a capital M is something we have to construct ourselves. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's that close, bro. Actually,
why not?
It's not. It really strikes me as existentialism. There is no, like, we're self-conscious now, and even now that we know what Peterson, if Peterson told us the truth, now we really know what's up. We know why we're self-conscious and stuff.
Okay.
So there is no real transcendent meaning.
But he says perhaps, no, that's right.
You create heaven. You exist. Existence precedes essence, bro. So now create this essence, right? Create, and it's kind of satanic, man. It's a little bit like the serpent whispering in your ear saying, hey, maybe you make this heaven and hell thing.
Right. And heaven and hell are realities in this world.
Yeah. And I know that, like, I know the dude. I love the guy. I don't think he's got malice malicious intent or anything, but it's like that is something that this crafty serpent would say.
Well, okay, but that's where I'm going though.
Yeah.
So Peterson is using words like heaven, and you're right. And this is what Christians need to understand is that he's using that in a metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
But anybody with any scrap of Christian upbringing is going to hear, perhaps heaven is something you must build. And you could read that ignorantly, man. And you could go, oh yeah, like I don't agree with Peterson.
We're all living stones, dude. Yeah, we're building up the kingdom of God and through evangelism or through right.
And it's up to us. But what Romans 2:7 says is he says to those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. Eternal life, immortality is it's a real thing. Peterson wants to shove it off into the realm of myth, which ultimately he derealizes it. He dereifies it. He says heaven is a place on earth. Heaven is, it's something we build ourselves, but really it's just an illusion. Ultimately, if we're being real about it, it's something that doesn't have any reality to it. The Bible says, no, it is real. It is something we can seek in this life, but it's ultimately not something that we achieve for ourselves. It's something that's given to us. It's a gift.
Well, and you have to have the right diagnosis as well, right? Like, because his
say it again.
You have to have the right diagnosis of hell and of moral corruption and sin, which is different than just suffering. Where he gets close to the Christian worldview in his discussion of evil, where he talks about, this is crazy. Only man could conceive of the rack, the Iron Maiden, and the thumb screw. Right? These torture instruments. Only man will inflict suffering for the sake of suffering. That is the best definition of evil I'm able to formulate. And I think of Silver Birch Ranch, a kids camp for Christian kids, where some dude grabbed a toad and just threw it in the fire. And everyone's laughing about it. And I'm like, I want to throw you in the fire, dude. What the heck? It still pisses me off. Yeah, are you still in here, bro? There you go. Okay, so only man can do that. But then he goes on to talk about a spark of the divine. Right, and he talks about how I don't think he can make sense of this in his worldview, except we're the self-conscious beings, so we've transcended the actual apes and stuff like that. But he still goes on, even though he can't really. I don't think he can account for it. He still says, "But we are these image bearers of God," and he talks in the first chapter about us having a soul or a spirit, even though that doesn't make sense within his either. But it's very, very useful, so he grabs it and uses it.
Well, he says that we're spiritual, so to speak.
Yeah, but then he uses it as if we're not, so to speak, right?
Right.
Because you have to. We have this. You can't escape it. So he does talk about. You were talking about this earlier about this dichotomy that he has, where we're like these wretched creatures who also like we don't even take care of ourselves, but we are so self-focused as well. And it's this. Van Til calls it the rationalist-irrationalist dialectic, where we pass back and forth between rationalism and irrationalism. And I find that in Peterson's book, in our treatment of ourselves. We're so worth it. Everyone should admire me, but we don't even admire us enough to take our freaking pills. And we don't even clean our own rooms. Right. And yet we think that we can solve the whole world and that we are uniquely individual and that can happen like this, dude. And you read in the Psalms, you see David going back and forth, right? Like that's part of the human experience of being made in the image of God and yet fallen.
Well, dude, and you see this in every non-Christian worldview. I mean, take atheistic Darwinianism, if you can sort of, put those together as they often do go together. Here you've got man as an evolved ape, the product of time and chance acting on matter. And no matter what anybody says, that worldview does lead to epistemological nihilism. It leads necessarily to the complete, well, as Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher, has said, we have a defeater for all our beliefs. And we've talked about this on the show before. Yeah. But so here you are, this mass of atoms, you're the end product of, a process leading from who is it that says from fish to philosophers, from goo to you? Yeah,
what is that? Dennett? Does Dennett say fish to philosophers?
That may be. That may be. I've heard Jeff Durbin and others, and I've used it myself. But here you are, this naked ape, and you are going to reason your way out around you're going to stretch the arms of your reason around the whole universe and tell us what it's all about.
Yeah.
And it's like, on the one hand, you show such utter contempt for yourself. You're a naked ape. You have no transcendent meaning at all.
Yeah.
And yet,
emotion, right? Yeah.
yes. And yet you're putting that mass of atoms on the throne of the universe as the arbiter of truth.
Right.
And it is Francis Schaeffer's upper and lower stories just in its most stark form. I know nothing and I know everything. And I know Schaeffer is obviously drawing heavily from Van Til as well, but I know everything and I know nothing. And, so there. Yeah, so that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Harumph.
Yeah. And dude, and this is where I think the Christian, if you take Genesis seriously, like a Christian would, you can actually account for those two perspectives, that looking at and looking along. Because, I don't think you like this terminology, but I think that we are animals, but we're not the rational animal of Aristotle. We're the image bearer animal of Genesis.
I like to say that we're not beasts.
Well, sure, and it's exactly right. We're not beasts because we have this self-reflective mind that is made in the image of God. We have a soul, right? We're spirit, like God is spirit.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't mean like in the same order of being, like God
analogous.
Yeah, of course. Exactly right. We're analogous to him. We're his we're his creatures. He is our creator. And we are the animals that were put here to arbitrate God's will in the world. So yeah, dude, we can look at ourselves scientifically, but we can never escape the first person perspective, the Lebenswelt, the looking along right? Like we can never do that. And you see philosophers like Tom Nagel, and I call him Tom now because we're on a first name basis. Thomas Nagel and Searle and all these guys who are non-Christians, they're atheists. They don't want to be Christian. They don't want to believe in God, but they have to say, hey, there's this observer independence that we have where we are conscious beings. And you cannot reduce that to the third person perspective. You can't do it because you are going to be the one doing it. And you're a first person perspective.
Right. And this is where I would just love for Peterson to get. I would love for him to arrive here.
Dude, totally.
And I'd love for him to see that, I'm not a huge Tim Keller guy, but he's got some amazingly wise quotes.
Yeah.
And one of his most famous quotes, Tim Keller, pastor in NYC. I've been to his church. No big deal. Just
great.
But I have been there. He says this quote, "The gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet," so Peterson would say, we're more chaotic than we could ever imagine. "Yet at the same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope." End quote. So, what's true about man at creation, that we are, we're dust, right? According to the Bible, we're animated dust.
Yeah.
And so we're lower than we could ever imagine. And yet we're dust that has had the breath of life breathed, sculpted by God, and we've had life breathed into us by the Almighty.
Yeah.
So even at creation, we are lower and higher than we could intuit.
This is what Pascal talks about. He calls man the thinking reed. The reeds are broken, they're bent, they're in the wind. And he says, this vast world engulfs us and overtakes us, and a little bug can kill us. Yet in thinking of it, we can master it.
Yes.
So we're this like paradoxical thinking reed.
Yeah.
Because we're so easily broken. We see that through this virus.
Yeah.
And yet we're here working on a antidote to it.
Right.
It's crazy.
Well, and then when you add in, now this is where the fall comes in and the story of redemption. This is why you need all 4 chapters of the 4-chapter gospel: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Yeah. Because at creation, this is true that we're lower and higher than we would have ever intuited on our own. But due to the fall, we are now morally lower.
Yeah.
Right. We've descended to look at the history of creation. I'm sorry, look at the history of humanity, but not just humanity. Dude, look at our own hearts, man.
Yeah. And right? we act like the beasts that we were supposed to master.
Yes, but lower than beasts.
Well, because I think Chesterton says this, that to call us beasts is an insult to beasts, because
That's
beasts couldn't do exactly what Peterson was
That's
saying.
exactly
Beasts,
right.
they don't make torture devices, right? Some of them, like a sparrowhawk, I think might put a sparrow on a fence or something like that and kill him. But we're very creative when it comes to torturing each other image bearers of God, let alone animals and stuff, right?
That's right. That's right. And yet then the gospel comes along. Jesus Christ comes along, and he gets down into the sewer of our depravity without himself ever once, drinking the sewer water or whatever, however the metaphor needs to go, right? He himself does not become polluted, and yet he allows himself to be contaminated by the effects of our corruption.
Yeah.
Right. He takes that on in a what's the word in it? It's imputed to him.
Yeah.
Right. And then he annihilates it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why. So Peterson goes, why didn't God just make us immortal? This is the answer to his question. Why didn't God just make man immortal right then and there? If that's the end goal. Well, because in Genesis, if he would have kept reading in Genesis chapter 3, the reason why God doesn't make man immortal from the get-go, he keeps him out of the garden, is because if man were to eat of the tree of life, he would live forever in his fallen state. And that was not God's plan. He wanted to redeem us. Well, that's where the cross comes in. The better tree, the tree of redemption.
Yeah, and Peterson, he brings up this theme in Genesis, Adam and Eve making themselves loincloths and stuff like that, right? And the Christian points to the end of Genesis 3 in the proto-evangelion or evangelium, where God is promising that the seed of the serpent is going to, there's this back and forth, you want to talk about a struggle between good and evil. The seed of the serpent is going to bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, but the seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. And then later you find these loincloths weren't enough. And God covers them with animal fur, with animal skin. So an animal blood had to be shed in order to cover the sin, and in order to cover that self-consciousness that Adam and Eve were experiencing from their sin. And so, we see that right there in Genesis. Why didn't God make them eternal right then? Because that wasn't actually the story. This reality is this drama. It does involve order and chaos, but it's for God's glory, right? And the gospel isn't the plan B, but actually it was plan A the whole time. And God allowed the serpent to tempt Adam and Eve in order for his own glory, right? Yeah. And he hates sin. He hates evil. Yeah. He didn't make us do any of that. Mm-hmm. I think it is a mystery in any way you look at it. How could that come about? Yeah. But it wasn't like God had his eyes closed and came down and, oh no, what are you guys doing?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I couldn't keep that serpent out. I couldn't keep the black dot out of the white space on the in the yin yang, symbol. Yeah. Oops, my bad. I didn't mean to let that potentiality for chaos come in.
Yeah.
Dude, Go ahead.
We got to wrap up here. So, but I wanted to bring us back to the actual rule. Right?
Please.
So Peterson talks all about this. Is he's developing his theory, or at least expressing his theory of order and chaos. Of why things are bad. Why is it that we like hate ourselves and we love our animals? I don't think he treated the animals enough. I don't think he dealt with that enough. But then he goes back, in conclusion, he says, to treat yourself as if you were someone you are responsible for helping is instead to consider what would be truly good for you. You can help direct the world on its careening trajectory a bit more towards heaven and a bit more away from hell. Once having understood hell, research it, so to speak, particularly your own individual hell, you could decide against going there or creating that. So that's why he was developing his theory of good and evil. That's why he's developing the self-consciousness versus consciousness. That's why he's talking about the creation myth as he sees it in the different JEDP models, in that model. And then he's bringing it all the way back, and he just summarizes it in like 2 or 3 pages here, saying, hey, so since that's the case, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for caring for, and in so doing, you will help create heaven. And if we all did that, we'd have a better place here on earth.
Yeah.
That seem fair? Does that seem like?
No, I think I do. I think it's accurate. I think it's an accurate representation.
Well, and then, dude, he goes, that would atone for your sinful nature, and replace your shame and self-consciousness with the natural pride and foreright or forthright confidence of someone who has learned once again to walk with God in the garden.
Okay.
And so, yeah, man, that is like a almost barfo disgusto self-help book, right? That's where it comes through. You're like, nah, man, we are the problem, and looking inside and solving your own problem. Dude, take care of yourself. Take your freaking pills. Do all that stuff. Regard yourself as an image bearer of God, for sure.
But an actual image bearer of God,
Right.
not as the product of time and chance acting on matter, and someone who biologically needs this medicine, and that's it. Really, that's ultimately it.
You don't owe you owe God.
Yes.
The breath in your lungs was put there by a divine creator, the archetype of everyone, right? Like he is a creator God, and you owe him everything. Take care of yourself as someone who's an image bearer of God, man.
Yeah.
Like you are terrible in that you were made for a purpose, and you continually go against God in the purpose for which you've been made. And you are awesome in that you've been made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a dog. You're not a dolphin. You are a human being. Take care of yourself. Act like it, right? But give yourself to God. Give yourself back to God. Be reconciled with your Creator. That's He's made atonement for you. You can't do it.
You can't do it. And Peterson, if he were to, Dr. Peterson, if he were consistent, man, wouldn't it be cool if he watched this? How cool would this be? So if he were to watch this, what I'd want to say is this: look, you by your own definition of what it means to be man, you recognize that we fall short of a glorious standard. By your own definition, you recognize that we don't live up to our potential.
Right.
Your statements of your statement to the hypothetical 20-year-old that he should not feel good about who he is today, but rather he should feel good about who he can become, shows that you recognize there is great potential in human beings, that we are more than evolved lobsters. We do have a spark of the divine in us, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And Peterson doesn't want to get new agey, and I don't want to get new agey, but that spark of the divine that you recognize is juxtaposed with the great evil that you recognize we have in our hearts. And the only way to truly restore order between these two competing forces is to heed the call of the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7, when he says, the thing I don't want to do, I do, and the thing I do want to do, this I don't do. Who shall save me from this? Who shall rescue me from this body of death? Wretched man that I am. And then he says, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's only Jesus Christ who is the way, the actual way in John 14:6. It's only through faith in Christ, the one who stretched out his hands as an invitation to all men, and yet ascended to heaven and was actually lifted up on the cross. It's only through his penal sacrifice, his punishment, and ultimate vindication by rising from the dead, that we can, be reconciled to the divine who has given us his spark, and that we can finally eradicate the evil that we have within us.
Yeah. Amen, man. Yeah. Finishing closing thought. Actually, I wanted to mention this. Peterson talks about how this was good. He talked about how the serpent now lives within us. And you talk about like the seed of the serpent. You can do a whole biblical theology of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman all the way throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, man, like, come on over, Peterson. Come over to the worldview where you can actually account for real evil and for real good and for real redemption, right? Like, for real heaven, for real meaning, for real purpose. Come on over, man. Quit dipping your toe.
It's good. It's good. All right. So, Park, how can people get in touch with you and all that good stuff? What's your website?
Yeah. Just go to parkersetacase.com. That's where my blog is at. You can find a lot of book reviews, stuff like that. And find me on Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah. Connect with the Think Institute by going to thethink.institute. Listen to this and every episode of the podcast by going to thethink.institute/podcast. Follow us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We're also on ThinkSpot, which is Jordan Peterson's social media. We're on Minds. We're on Gab. We're on, we're on all kinds of stuff. But follow us for more great content and to get tips and tools to help you explain, share, and defend the Christian message. So as always, this is not goodbye. This has just been a little pit stop along the road, a little detour into the proverbial Garden of Eden. So we were able to kind of snake our way past the cherubim, past the flaming sword, go back over, see what things were like.
Yeah.
No, we didn't do any of that stuff. We didn't do any of that. I got to backtrack.
What happened, man?
Well, you got to cut me off, man.
Jeez,
man,
you got enough rope to hoist yourself on your own petard there.
Yeah, that's not what that.
Yeah, you're lifting yourself on your own coat collar. Okay, no, as always, I hope that it made you very self-conscious.
Hope that it sliced you up with a flaming sword.
That doesn't.
Hope it did.
Yeah. All right.
Until next time. Yep. That's it. Goodbye. Oh, like and share this. What are you doing? You still watching?
Come on.
Like and share this. Like it on Facebook. Subscribe to our channel. I gotta say this stuff, man. People aren't subscribing. They're watching, and where are you gonna go?
I gotta go. I got
You're
stuff
just a kid. You're just a snot-nosed punk kid. You don't have anything to do.
I'm gonna go protest the lockdown.
I'll be right there with you. All right, peace. Protest.